Okay, well, thanks very much for the invite to this, what looks like a really exciting and interesting conference today. I've only got sort of 15 minutes, so unlike Chris, I'm going to be covering 5,000 years rather than the full 8. Something about Cardiff University obviously does this to you, I think. Makes you think in the long term, but the short term is so problematic. And I think I'll start, I think this will kind of move on quite nicely from Chris's, well, if I can do this at all. Maybe I'll just do that instead. This will hopefully move on quite nicely from Chris's talk, because what Chris didn't talk about at all is the stuff outside cities. That's where I'm going to start. Because we need to think about the why of cities when we try and understand what the future of cities will be. And this is a lovely quote from Mark Livrani, who wrote a book about the ancient Near East. And he says that what cities do is they suck in resources from the outside and they deliver culture and ideology. And that's what cities did originally. And what cities did was they added value to societies by doing the things and reducing the transaction costs Chris talked about in some key elements which will become the basis of future complex societies. So things like grain storage, bureaucracy, the organisation of military, the organisation of kind of unifying myths around things like religion, they are much better done in cities than they are done in the countryside. And of course, what cities also did at that time is start to control key resources. So you think about the Fall of Troy on BBC a month or two ago, very depressing series. Everyone dies at the end, virtually, apart from the baddies. Typical Greeks, everyone dies apart from the baddies. The control of key resources, control of key transportation nexus. At the same time as dragging in natural resources, mineral resources, the Romans dragging, in the imperial sense, marble from Spain, wheat from North Africa, wood from Germany. So the city being this kind of, a driver of kind of incoming of material wealth and labour, and a kind of outgoing of organisational and managerial competence, if you like. The Industrial Revolution changed that somewhat, because what that did was make cities also the locus of production. So unlike pre-industrial times, largely where value is created on the land, you think about the kind of Bosworth and Johnsons in the coffee houses of London in the 16th, 17th centuries, drinking the coffee and eating the sugar of empire, along with the lords who owned large rural estates, but were spending their wealth in cities. So, that model of the land giving wealth to the city changed the Industrial Revolution, and what we have is cities becoming much more intrinsically valuable, if you like, because factories moved into cities. And what cities do then is dragging certainly labour from outside, but they start to create value within themselves. Innovation, we've got a picture of Cambridge there, the idea of education, being located in places, and then you come through this kind of Marshallian idea of value being created in the air between companies, between, people like my colleague Kevin Morgan, who's speaking right now somewhere else in Cambridge, very frustrating. People like Kevin Morgan says, this nexus then between the public and private and third sectors becoming a really interesting driver of value, typically in large, dense, agglomerated places. And that has been true, I think, certainly for the last 150 years. Now, the problem that we have when we think about what this means in a digitizing or digital or automated or algorithmic world is that value proposition is changing very significantly. And the problem, I think, is value is becoming created aspatially. And this is where I kind of maybe diverge from what Chris's view of the ongoing kind of inevitable trend of increasing urbanization. Things which cities have done up until now and received value from are becoming done by transnational organisations to a far greater degree, and those organisations are dragging value out of the production, distributive, consumption process at almost every stage. So you think about Netflix. My kids get me paying £8, £9 a month to watch films when they really should be outside doing nice things in the fresh air and green spaces. Many of my friends will go out and do things in the fresh air and green spaces and then pay £7 a month to log them on Strava so they can see how they're not going to die. They track their cycling. And when we look at things like distribution processes, from Amazon down to Uber Eats, every part of that process has been captured by largely American corporations. which are effectively aspatial, non-national, not even transnational anymore. They exist in very, very small, concentrated places, are headquartered in Palo Alto and various other places a long way from here. At the same time, of course, the real value, the stuff is not being created in the West at all. It's being created in the cities of China. So we're losing both the productive value from cities, and we're losing the ability to charge rents to get value to the spaces between production and consumption. And that, I think, is a huge challenge for cities where at the same time, even the basic bread and butter of our welfare, energy and water, for example, has been obtained by largely non-national corporations. So if you drink from a tap in Cambridge, you are drinking from, funny enough, a Hong Kong-based conglomerate's water, or the pipes and the delivery. One or two places in the UK, it's not true. Do Cymru, for example, is not for profit in Wales, so I drink Welsh water, it's probably Welsh. Some of you do as well. But typically, what we find is that most of the welfare adding, whether they're kind of in the Maslow's hierarchy, trivial or fundamental aspects, are added by non-national, non-local, non-urban corporates. And that value is very difficult to tax. The good thing about having factories in cities is, again, as Chris hinted, it's very easy to regulate them, to decide where they can and can't go, and to tax the value that comes out of those factory gates. Very much more difficult currently. Now, what we have on top of this, of course, is a significant incursion of technology into this productive process. Obviously, this is happening in China and Hong Kong and Taiwan as it is in the West. But in the West, what we have is a particular issue with our urban form, because the sorts of activities that the urban spaces have been created to deliver are becoming less attractive, less important. So, for example, my own city, Cardiff, is full of call centres. We have a very large insurer called Admiral, which employs 3,000 or 4,000 across South Wales, answering the phone to people who've crashed their car effectively. We have some very big legal companies or partnerships, Eversheds and so on, largely back office operations for those paralegal type stuff. We have audit accountants like Deloitte. All of those jobs could be gone in 10 years. I'm training kids in my business school to be accountants who won't exist. I have a real issue with that morally and ethically. Because those jobs could be done by algorithms tomorrow, yesterday, 5 years ago, if we want, for the lobbying power of some of those organisations. On top of that, we already see some of the lifestyle changes enabled by some of these technology companies sucking value to the economy and also stopping people using pubs. Yeah, we see, for example, people don't go to the pub anymore. Why? You just buy the beer cheap from Tesco, you go home, you watch a Netflix film, drink in the house. People aren't using shops anymore. Why? Because you get it from Amazon. Yeah, so our physical spaces in cities, the raison d'etre for a non-manufacturing city is on the wane. We're at those tipping points we've already heard about. And of course, at the same time, when we are looking to transition from jobs which are, technologically vulnerable into jobs which are more creative, maybe oriented towards growth sectors such as elder care. Those, maybe looking at processes of whole life education so we can respond to continuing waves of technological incursion into our lives. At the same time as we need all that, value is being dragged out of our economies by these corporates who aren't paying tax typically in the places they operate. Something what we're doing in Cardiff University at the moment is looking at trying to understand some of the spatial scale of this. You can't do this city level, certainly in Western Europe as far as we can tell, because a lot of the data you need, for example, even on occupations, is not available sufficiently at anything below NUTS 2 scale. So this is looking at the vulnerability and opportunity of kind of digital and other technological incursions, algorithms and so on, into both working lives and more generally to kind of the socio-economic kind of sphere. So rather than just looking at jobs, tasks and industries and occupations, we're also looking at who owns capital. Yeah, so where does if capital is getting more returns compared to labour over time, because we're all moving into non-human work commodities, produced commodities, then we need to think about who owns capital. We need to think about things like R&D spend, obviously, how much capital there is and how new it is in the regions in this case, as well as the usual kind of routine operations we might look at being replaced. And you can see that this is a story in the UK, as far as we can see, of the northwest and northeast being really in trouble. Large, still manufacturing cities to some degree, together with things like a lot of white-collar routine operations in those cities, which look pretty vulnerable. Some of the very poor areas, like my own area of Wales, might resist this a bit longer because they have large amount of public sector activity, so health, education, social care, which may take longer to automate if only for kind of political reasons rather than economic reasons. But it looks like London's probably going to get away with it again. And places like East Scotland or Aberdeen, you've got a lot of R&D and obviously very keen natural resource oil going forward for at least another couple of decades. So what this means is that we have to think about what our cities do for us in the future, not now. And I think we are not looking at just trying to predict and fulfill kind of past trends. There's no value being created in the British economy, no additional value. Productivity since 2007, and it's been stagnant, completely stagnant. No additional value has been created in Britain in the last 10 years. And of course, because the Bank of England is therefore keeping real interest rates negative to make sure that it doesn't destroy the zombie companies and zombie households who would be insolvent if we had interest rates at the 5% they were pre-crisis. What's happening? Well, the stock market is very volatile, Brexit aside, which of course is a good thing for the stock market. But people don't like to put their money in volatile stock markets. There are no interesting, innovative developments. Keynes would have talked about the marginal efficiency of capital being on the wane because nothing interesting is being invented. Really good book by Rob Gordon on this, which I recommend you read, called Rise and Fall of American Growth. So people are sticking their money into real estate, property, which is exactly the thing that got us where we were in 2005, 6, 7. My mother, who's a Valleys girl who grew up in the Valleys, is now kind of, worked in the public sector her entire life. My dad was a factory worker before he died. She owns 2 properties, or part owns 2 properties she doesn't live in. That's staggering to me, that somebody in their 60s would think that the way to plan for her very short future, potentially quite short future, I shouldn't say that, sorry ma'am, is to buy 2 extra houses or 2 extra properties. So what we've got is a really dysfunctional approach to our kind of to land and to our urban form. And of course, what we see is that private debt is significantly higher than really any time post World War II. It's coming down a little bit, but going back up again now, actually. And that there's a real interesting intergeneration thing going on there. Yeah, that the debt is owned by people under 40, particularly under 30. People who are in no position to buy houses, therefore I'd rent them off my mother. Terrifying thought. My mother's my landlord. She was for 17 years old, bad enough. So we've got some real interesting and predictable trends. Are we responding to them? No. Again, I'll come back to my city, Cardiff. My university is currently, or has just spent £100 million on new buildings. My university has a debt of £300 million, very good interest rate. To do this, it's a big problem of expansion in Cardiff University. This is the number of 18 to 20-year-olds in the UK. Going forward, we are the red bar now. And for the next 10 years, effectively, there are fewer and fewer undergraduates in the UK age cohorts. So this year, our current applications are down by 3% compared to last year. We've got another 7 or 8 years of that going forward. So unless we can squeeze even more Asian postgraduate students in, then who's going to be in these big shiny buildings? And I think you can roll forward student accommodation in Cardiff. The biggest building, the highest building in Cardiff is student accommodation. Cardiff is drowning in student accommodation because everyone's building like it's 2003. So in summary then, I think city planners, and again this is where I think a Hayekian approach to this is problematic because it seems to me that we cannot let the property market run when people are offering me on Twitter 8% return per annum on a residential care home off plan. That, at the same time we're talking about there being no money for social care. The social care system in England is collapsing. The social care system in Wales is almost the same. And yet I'm being offered 8% per annum return on student housing, on residential social care for elderly, off plan, based on flipping a property asset. I find that very, cognitively very dissonant. And there has to be some way of understanding the evidence, as Chris has shown us, in terms of what good living looks like. We know what good living looks like at whatever scale of density. At the moment, what we're not doing is building it. We seem to be building for for a decade ago, if not a century ago. Thank you very much.